corner with a bunch of trees and houses behind it, so there's no sign. Yeah, if you don't know, if you're not going to it, you won't find it, sort of thing. So, I actually like that we're a small, intimate group here, because as we were talking about just throughout the week, it feels much more important to have the right conversation with the right people than to try and have a big conversation with a bunch of people that aren't the right people. And I can just tell from talking with almost all of you, hi, I'm Joe, by the way, we haven't met yet, that this is definitely the right people for this conversation. We're going to get started with Quinn doing a little bit of housekeeping and helping to set us up. And then I'm going to give a talk that's going to be a context setting talk that really helps you all understand what this Regenerate Cascadia thing is and what we're doing. It will have a closing with Brandon, wherever Brandon is. He's in the restroom. Talking about next steps with Regenerate Cascadia in a more sort of organizer-oriented way. And then we're going to have an agenda throughout the day of workshops and talks and emergent agenda, which is we're going to create it together. So then maybe that's all I'll say to get started, and then pass it over to Quinn.
First thing, I'll just kind of introduce the flow of the day. So it's already about 11. We're planning to go until 6. So Joe's going to start off giving us this context setting presentation talk, and Brandon will jump in at the end of that. And then we'll move into Brandon doing bioregional mapping presentation / workshop. And then that'll lead us into lunch, which maybe by now it looks more like 1 o'clock. And then we'll have a good chunk of time for lunch. We're wanting this to be open and not like squeezing everything in. So that'll go on lunch. Kirsten and Brett are cooking some amazing food. And it'll be a time for cross-pollination. And we have an idea of like micro talks maybe, so like Alexander and Sean might have some things they want to share, and folks can, share what they're up to in more of a collective conversation. And then in the afternoon, maybe by 2:30, Thomas will be doing an earthquake resiliency workshop, which maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Oh yeah, just kind of getting into the importance of being prepared for the earthquake and how much potential there is for what we're thinking and planning and doing with bioregional regeneration and bioregional organizing to really amp up and support and intervene in the earthquake preparedness discussion and efforts in ways that are currently being overlooked.
Cool. So stick around for that around 2:30. And then we'll move into Michael's collaborative session if you want to explain a little bit about that.
I'm going to be talking about regenerative economics, but you are the regenerative economics. So it's going to be a completely interactive session of how we can use technology into what I call community intelligence system, and how we can focus around land projects to actually create these new locally independent but yet connected economic systems quickly, because we need to. And so it's going to incorporate everything that you're doing here, so I'm taking it in, and we're going to have some fun and play with it. Just interact.
Yeah, and then that last couple hours or so will be just more open cross-pollination time. I know of at least 20 or so folks who will be coming in throughout the day, so it'll be lots of different flows, and we'll work with that and play with it. And then a little later, we'll be at the Haven, which is an art collective space just less than a mile north, and that will be kind of an after party just more time to exist in that creative space. They have some really epic creatives there and healing spaces, so they'll have like massage therapists, body workers, and whatnot there to kind of hold some of this energy as well. So that'll be from 7 to 10 p.m. And then back to this event, so that's kind of the schedule sequence. And then donations, so we have a suggested donation of like $20 to $40, which would include meal and this whole situation, but zero pressure at all for that. And that money would be going towards space use contribution for bridge space, which reminds me of one other thing. We'll have a friend come a little later who will share about bridge space and what this project's all about as a community commons. So we want to support them in which ways we can. Some more of that money will go towards covering little expenses we have for this tour and these events. And then also a fundraiser for an indigenous organization, which is to be determined, but likely NEA or Wisdom of the Elders, which some of y'all are probably familiar with. To be transparent about all that, so that's where the donations would be going. My Venmo is up there, and then if you want to do cash, you can just give it to one of our organizers, and we'll make that all work. And then a big part of this tour is like we kind of had a pre-activation phase, and now we're in the here and now, and then what are we going to do going forward? We've been exploring some different kind of post-activation scenarios where we'll have gatherings and different sessions and field trips, etc. So I'll pass this around for local folks to write their name and contact if they want to be involved in that. And the first thing will be on Tuesday evening from 6 to 9 p.m. Not determined where exactly that is, but it'll be that next step from like, here's us giving this gift to y'all, and y'all are participating in this way, and then like the next step is everybody really co-creating in a more engaged fashion. So I'll pass this around, and do we have any questions before we get going?
One very important process thing is the restrooms are just here around the corner if anyone needs one. You can enter through that little office space there or through the side door. There are 2 restrooms in this hall. Very important thing.
Are you going to record what Joe is going to say?
That's another thing. So it's gonna be live streamed on the Cascadia Department of Bioregion YouTube. So if you want to send that to folks that you're thinking of in your mind who couldn't make it right now, that would be a great thing to do right now. And then it'll automatically upload to that YouTube channel. And we'll be sending that around to folks as well, that link. So, yeah.
One other quick note on the earthquake preparedness, just for this space, on the very unlikely event that we do feel shaky, exit immediately through those spaces as considered.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Just run out that.
Probably the best bet is to actually get into the hallway. I mean, I wouldn't press.
We don't have a solid, yeah.
I'm going to the hallway and out.
That's what our workshop's about. How do we get out of here with the yeah, so, yeah, we'll have Joe introduce himself and get going.
Cool.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Quinn. So, hi everyone. I know most of you. Some of you we've just met. So my name's Joe Brewer, and I don't really want to spend much time talking about me and who I am and why I'm here. I'm just a Missouri chicken farmer who's done good. I grew up in Missouri and moved around the world. Currently live in Bar HR, Columbia, which we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing there as part of this talk, because it helps give a sort of a concrete experiential understanding of other places that are trying to do bioregional scale regeneration. And I guess what I want to say to get started is that I'm here with my partner Penny and with our teammate Stephen, who's handling all the IT and tech, and partnering with Brandon, and then another silent partner, Claire Atwell, who's in Victoria, Vancouver Island. She'll be joining us for a later part of the tour, and part of the tour is like 4 days or 5 days in Victoria. And so we actually have a process that's been going since March or April, where we've been talking about what it would mean to engage a place like Cascadia that has such a strong and rich history, and yet at the same time remains largely fragmented and isolated within itself for the many things that are happening, and how it could really become a prototype, an exemplar, a leader for the world, not only in namesake for Cascadia is probably the best known bioregion in the world, but as part of, more specifically I should say, as part of a planetary network of learning exchanges. And so we'll touch on that a little bit near the end of my talk about how we are creating learning exchanges between different bioregions, and the Cascadia Activation Tour is part of it. But I really want to go bigger picture first. And share why we must work at the scale of bioregions, and how nothing less will do. And why, if we don't do this, our children and grandchildren, or grandchildren's grandchildren, may not live, may not come to be. Human extinction is a real possibility with what's going on in the world. And so, so I want to set a context that is both kind of sobering and grounding, and then hopefully inspiring. Because as we're going to see in the talk I'm about to give, there is a systemic and holistic understanding that can be pieced together from many people's work that enables us to see the only pathway to planetary sustainability for humans. And that's what we are walking into being. And that's what Regenerate Cascadia is a part of. And so when I've given this talk earlier in the week, I've gone through the title, and it's actually been really helpful to say, you know, I'm a cognitive linguist. I worked with a guy named George Lakoff at one point in time, and have done frame analysis with social movements. So I care a lot about language. And so I picked these words intentionally. And so I just want to roll through them. The word how is actually super important, because it's not, do we regenerate Cascadia? Like maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. It's yes, we do. And how? How do we do it? How does this actually work? How do we work at this huge scale? And then the word regenerate, I'm going to leave the word we aside. I'm not even going to touch that one, because I think we're going to find that the we is going to be a continually navigated political exploration of who is the we. Is the we indigenous? Is the we people from California? You can start to feel that that the we is a big, big question that I'm not going to answer. I don't live here. I cannot answer it. I did live in Seattle for 9 years and Eugene for about 5, so a third of my life has been in Cascadia. So I do think I can speak for Cascadia, but I live on another continent. I live in South America and Colombia. So I may or may not be part of that we. This word regenerate is super important, because regeneration has already been greenwashed and stolen. If you don't believe me, look at Gates Foundation and regenerative agriculture, and you'll see that the greenwashing is well underway, except they're going to lose. Because regeneration, as anyone who actually studies regeneration knows, is the inherent living dynamics of any living being in any living system. And so you actually can't greenwash it. All the people who are confused and don't have ecological knowledge are going to be confused whether it's greenwashed or not. But if we understand concepts like autopoiesis, the self-perpetuating dynamic of a living system, continually creating the conditions conducive to life, we're talking about regeneration in Cascadia, which means there are a lot of living processes already here. There's a lot of work to do in harmony with them. And there are certain regenerative processes that have been damaged, that are at risk. There's a lot of degradation of landscapes. There's a lot of harm to marine ecosystems, et cetera, and so forth. And so we need to work with regenerative processes and help create holistic healing and holistic flourishing of the bioregion. And then Cascadia, as I think everyone here probably knows, is a word that goes back decades. And as Brandon could speak to, it's been used to describe a kind of geology. It's been used to describe a political identity. It's been used to help support the creation of a secessionist movement, where basically the way I like to say it is when Canadians are pissed at the Canadian government and those of us in the US are pissed at the US government, we would rather be Cascadians than either of those nation states. That is a sentiment held by many people and in recurring waves. And so Cascadia has a very long political history. Also, Cascadia as a bioregion is a place that has a very impressive concentration of human capacities, of people who have been doing a lot of permaculture work, have been doing a lot of collaborative work with First Nations people, a lot of land defenders work, a lot of just good science, just learning how these systems work, and a lot of alternative economic models, lots of eco-villages, on and on and on. And so this is a place that has a huge amount going on, which brings up this question: if we're doing an activation tour, what are we activating if there's already 50 years or more of history? And I think that'll become clear as I go through the slides. But I want to set this a little bit of context because what we want to talk about is how do we regenerate Cascadia? And to do that, we need to first have at least a shared initial sense of why we need to. So I'll do a little touching on that, and then we'll go into the how. And the way that I like to start this conversation is with an observation that I am by no means the first person to make, which is that when you look at the Earth from space, you'll notice a complete absence of political boundaries. You'll notice that the Earth doesn't care where India ends, where Tibet begins, where Mongolia is. It doesn't care about our political fictions. And that's because the Earth is a holistic and integrated, dynamic, continually evolving system. And because it is so interdependent and interwoven, this leads to a variety of systemic risks. And right now we are in the mother lode of systemic risks. We're like in a touch point of transformation for the planet. And I just wanted to observe really quickly that this integration is so complete that if you looked at every pixel in this image and I asked you, where is the water and where is there not water, all you'd be able to say is there's probably water in every single pixel. Because there's water in the ocean, on the land, there are lakes and rivers. In the atmosphere, there are clouds, and then there's water vapor. And the water is continually integrating with the entire planet. It's even in the magma. It's part of the lubricant of the subduction zones, bringing ocean seafloor back into magma as part of the cycling of carbon in the core of the, not in the core of the Earth, but in the Earth's inner dynamics. And so there's even water below the surface. Going hundreds of kilometers below the surface, there's water. And so when you look at the planet Earth and say, wow, all this water is everywhere, you start to see that there are these interdependencies. And these interdependencies reveal a unique challenge and opportunity for us as humans right now. The way that I want to set the context for why we need to do regeneration at large scales is to just do a really quick check-in of where are we as a planet at the moment. So just quick show of hands, who here has heard of the planetary boundaries framework? So most of us, pretty much everyone. Cool. I found that a lot of people have heard of the planetary boundaries but don't actually know what they are. So I just want to quickly walk through them to be sure we have a shared understanding. The planetary boundaries are an answer to a specific question asked by the Stockholm Resilience Center. The question was, with everything we know about the dynamic Earth as Earth scientists, are there any thresholds that if we crossed that threshold, the ability to have complex city-states and civilizations and global supply chains, all the things that have been possible during the last 12,000 years of warm, stable climate, this period called the Holocene, that we would leave the Holocene and the idea of a globalized civilization is called into question. Because the very basis of its capacity to exist is the stability of large-scale transport systems, supply chains, agriculture, and large population centers. And so they started gathering the research from a community of about 3,500 Earth system scientists, people that studied atmospheric chemistry and oceanography and plate tectonics and on and all these different things. And they said, okay, so how many boundaries are there? There are 9. There are 9 boundaries. That if you cross one of them, the whole global civilization thing probably goes away. And so just to roll through them really quickly, climate change is only one. Then there's biosphere integrity, which is a way of saying the rate of extinction. Because if you empty out ecosystems, they lose their resilience and collapse. This is the mass extinction event that's happening. The rate of extinction is the measure of biosphere integrity. Then there's land system change, which is taking healthy, complex ecosystems and degrading them, cutting them down for extractive use, or for replacing them to make agriculture or urban landscapes or whatever. About a third of the land area of the Earth is currently degraded landscapes. So land system change, which is a major cause of the extinctions. So these things are connected with each other. Then there's freshwater use, because only 1% of the world's water is freshwater. And if the fresh water is not available, or if it's too contaminated, then that causes problems for the whole globalized system. Then there's biogeochemical flows, which is the reactive nitrogen and phosphorus used in nitrogen fertilizers in industrial agriculture that runs off into our waterways, creates dead zones at the mouths of all of our rivers, is causing the potential collapse of the food chain in the world's oceans. Then there's ocean acidification, that if the ocean becomes too acidic, calcium carbonate begins to dissolve. Then there are no longer coral reefs, no longer mollusks, no longer all kinds of things in the marine ecosystems of the world ocean, which would cause the food chains of the world to collapse. Atmospheric aerosol loading, which is just a fancy way of saying air pollution. There's too much air pollution, it can disrupt the whole global system. Stratospheric ozone depletion, which is that we have this ozone layer in the world in the stratosphere that absorbs the ultraviolet radiation, enabling life to exist on land. And then there's this last one, this catch-all called novel entities, which is any chemical created by humans that the Earth doesn't know what to deal with. And so they were like, all right, there are 9 of them. There's a natural question that's begged by identifying 9 of them. Right? It's like, all right, if we only cross one, globalized civilization probably goes away. There are 9 of them. How are we doing? How are we doing? So between 2009 and 2015, they gathered all the research and started looking into things. And they're like, oh, they published a paper in 2015 that says, we've crossed 4 of them. We've crossed the boundaries for climate change, biosphere integrity, land system change, and biochemical flows. But then the research continues, and because it's peer-reviewed scientific research, there are time delays as they debate and gather data and do assessments and argue things out, and so it takes a few years. So in 2021, they come along and say, where is it? We've crossed 2 more. Freshwater use and ocean acidification. Funny thing, about a month ago, they published this in Science and just declared it, but it's 2021 that the researchers at Stockholm Resilience Center were announcing it in podcast interviews and other places. This is how long it took for the peer review to verify what they already knew from their data in 2021. And then in 2022, this one, they still say there are only 6, but 2022, they added microplastics. Microplastics that are in every ounce of breast milk of every woman on Earth and in every water supply on Earth. And they are hormone disruptors and other lovely things that the Earth doesn't know what to deal with. And so these numbers aren't when we crossed these boundaries. These are just when the scientific community agreed through the consensus process of peer review that we had crossed them. So when someone says, we have until 2030 to avoid catastrophic climate change, they are fucking lying to you. Okay, let's just be blatant. That's an F-bomb opportunity right there. They're lying to you. Because first of all, abrupt climate change is happening now, mostly from the accumulation of changes to the 1980s because of time delays. And that doesn't account for any of the rest of this when this is the state of the world. And so I just wanted to take a moment to observe what is not going to address this situation. Changing your light bulbs, going from an internal combustion engine in your single occupancy vehicle to a battery in your single occupancy vehicle that you get by mining the ocean floor or mountaintop removal, probably not going to fix this. And a whole slew of consumer products that can be purchased and make money for billionaires, probably not going to fix this either. And so what this tells us is that we have to imagine a wholesale transformation of the human existence on Earth if we want to survive. That is what this actually tells us. And so what I want to do now is just step through another way of thinking about this. Why do these planetary boundaries exist? The planetary boundaries exist because there are tipping points in the Earth system. There are many of them. The study that created this graphic has 11. Some have 15, some have 20. Sometimes they lump them together, sometimes they separate them. But I just want to show you a couple examples. I'm not going to talk through all of them. But look at the dieback of the boreal forest. The boreal forest is the world's largest forest, twice as large as the Amazon. It goes around the Arctic Circle. Did anyone notice the wildfires in Canada this year? Do you think the boreal forest might be starting to die back? If it's not yet, do you think the drying out from all those forest fires, do you think that's not going to speed up the dieback of the boreal forest? Do you know how much carbon dioxide will be released by the boreal forest dying back? The second largest forest on Earth, the Amazon, is on schedule to permanently transition to grassland savanna between 2024 and 2026. To deforestation, combined with the fragmentation of the remaining parts, that shuts off what's called the biotic pump, which is what brings all the moisture from the Atlantic into South America. And then you've got the Greenland ice sheet, which will cause sea level rise, the West Antarctic ice sheet, which will cause several meters of sea level rise, the Atlantic circulation, or what's called the thermohaline circulation, the deep water formation in the North Atlantic, which will shut down if too much fresh water is drained off the Greenland ice sheet. The Siberian permafrost, which is already creating huge craters as methane is being released. It's basically 4 meters thick of frozen vegetation that as the permafrost starts to thaw, the microbial activity releases huge amounts of methane. And then you start to see a picture of how these thresholds work. And by the way, these tipping points are related to each other. As some of them happen, they cause cascades, making others more likely to happen. And I just want to show an example of this to make this really concrete. If you look at this one, this is the Arctic ice feedback. It works like this. There's global warming, which of course is much higher in high latitudes. You know, 5 times to 10 times as much heating in the high latitudes as at the equator. That warms the Arctic Ocean, which reduces the Arctic sea ice. Well, Arctic sea ice, 90% reflection of sunlight back into space. But when you replace it with open ocean during the summer, 90% absorption of sunlight into the ocean. You go from a white reflective surface to a dark blue surface. That means less sunlight is reflected into space, ocean absorbs more heat, which increases atmospheric warming. This is a positive feedback loop. This is an accelerating system. And this is what's called the blue ocean event. Which is what happens when the Arctic Ocean no longer has sea ice in the northern hemisphere. Which is currently on schedule to happen by 2030. Which is every year when you look, there are these big fluctuations in Arctic sea ice from year to year, but pretty soon, the first year with no Arctic sea ice, and this is going to take off. And the question becomes, how does this change the weather patterns of the entire planet? Because the weather patterns of the Earth are dictated by jet streams. Jet streams that happen in the stratosphere that are the anchors for the storm tracks that tell us where all of our weather systems happen. And I just want to notice this one. This is that famous omega, see the capital letter omega. That is the pattern that brings you the rainy season in the winter here in the Northwest. So what do you think is going to happen when there's no longer sea ice and the thermodynamics of the mixing completely change, and all of the jet streams start going completely turbulent, and you no longer have stable winter rains in the Pacific Northwest, a defining feature of Cascadia? The lesson in all of this is that the Earth is a whole system with all of these interacting parts. And all the interacting parts have cascading relationships and they have time delays. What that means is that breakdowns occur across space and time. Just as an example of a time delay, all of the heating we see that's creating tropical storms and hurricanes is based on atmospheric heating, whereas the ocean heats about 30 years slower, which means if you want to know how much global warming has affected the world's ocean, go back in time 30 years, basically the mid-90s. Say how much accumulated heating has happened up to the mid-90s, that's how much the ocean heating has absorbed, because heating water in a bathtub is much slower than heating air. And the world ocean is a frickin' huge bathtub. So the time delays are 30 to 40 years. So these time delays are a really big deal. Now the lesson in this is that we have a huge systemic pattern of risk. And the risk emerges through the interactions of the different parts of the planet. But there's a silver lining in that message. The silver lining is, look how much we know about the Earth. Look how far our knowledge has come. And if there are interdependencies that create systemic risk, those same interdependencies can build up systemic resilience. This is the secret message no one is telling. The secret message is if we can work with the processes of the planet across the different places where they interact, we can restore stability to them. We can build up their mutually reinforcing stability patterns. But in order to do that, we have to do regeneration at a scale that most people haven't even dared to dream, let alone consider that it can actually be done. And so, I want to share with you an insight that I've gained from traveling around the world looking at regenerative projects. Because I've visited lots of permaculture centers, reforestation projects, conservation projects, education centers, retreat centers, eco-villages. They're all wonderful, and they're all defined by the boundaries of a plot of land. We've got our 10 acres of land, we're doing a wonderful agroforestry project, and the boundary is the plot of land. The problem with this is that every plot of land is embedded within a larger set of ecological connections. As an example, if you had a lovely permaculture farm in a watershed, and someone upstream from you dumps pollutants into your water, those pollutants are going to flow across your land. There's a larger set of ecological connections. The beauty of this is that these ecological connections are organized into holistic landscapes, like watersheds, coastal estuaries, local hydrological cycles for precipitation. Right? There are larger holistic systems that the ecological connections are already organized into. And these holistic landscapes are embedded within larger planetary processes, like some of the ones we were just looking at, where the melting of the sea ice changes the weather patterns, the moisture from the Pacific that brings our rain, and these larger planetary processes. Now, when I was looking for the pathway to planetary sustainability, and I look at any of these levels, I can't find the path, because it doesn't exist at any of these levels. But then I shifted my thinking, and I see that it actually exists in the relationship between the levels. It actually exists in the relationship between the levels, which is, if I can articulate what a landscape is as a whole holistic system, I can identify all of the plots of land where there are already regenerative projects within the landscape, and I can leverage the ecological connections to weave the plots of land, to weave the regenerative projects into the regeneration of holistic landscapes. As an example, we were just in Eugene, Oregon, where they have the McKenzie River that runs down the western Cascades, that joins the Willamette River and then enters into the Willamette Valley. The McKenzie River forms a watershed that is a holistic landscape. It's got a snow melt, it's got an inclination, currently it's got a couple of dams, it's got some deforestation, it's got some agriculture. That drainage is a holistic landscape. There are several plots of land where there are already regenerative projects. National forest, some of it's protected, some of it's just for exploitation. conservation land, regenerative farms, what have you. So we can start to work with those projects and help them to collaborate and organize themselves around holistic landscapes. And as we do this, we start to see that landscapes are connected to each other as tapestries of landscapes, and that they organize into larger scale systems. And I want to show you how that works. So to start to see how we build systemic resilience, I'm going to start with a really simple observation that is absolutely profound when you think about it, which is everything that happens anywhere on Earth happens somewhere. Sort of deceptive, isn't it? Everything that happens anywhere on Earth happens somewhere, which means we can engage in place-based interventions and initiate the interactions with other places because of the interdependencies between places. And so when we look at something like here's, North American continent, it's good to know where are we. So where are we? Huh? We're right there, right? Here we are. We're in a place. And when we start to look at our place, we see that our place is very wise, very intelligent, and has already organized itself in very powerful ways. So, how does place organize itself? This thing worked. There we go. Every place has a geologic history that tells you how it was before, how it formed, how it came to be. Every place has an ecological history. It says it's this kind of climate, these kinds of soils, these kinds of forests, these kinds of grasslands, these kinds of species. There's a huge, rich geologic and ecological history. And if humans live in the place, there's also a cultural history. How did humans inhabit this place? What kinds of cultures did they have? What kinds of economies did they have? Were they sustainable? What did they use to make clothing? How did they get their food? And so that means that every place has, this thing will work, come on you, boom, a story of place. The story of the place is everything that's happened before that gives rise to the way the place is now. What's interesting about a story of place is that it's still alive and it's still happening. So if I'm from New York and I move to Portland, I enter the story of this place, that is still unfolding. So we can start to feel into the storying of place. What's amazing about constructing our story of place is we start to learn what is unique because of its unique geologic history, its unique ecological history, and its unique cultural history. And it makes the place very special. It allows us to feel that we can belong in the place, which is a very important human capacity. And then we can cultivate whole system understandings of our place. How does this place function? What would it mean for this place to be healthy? And from those whole system understandings, we can start to imagine regenerative futures. We can start to design and intend and create scenarios and agendas and plans around our regenerative futures. All of this is given to you by the place. So place-based transformation is possible because the place guides us in so many powerful ways. This is a place like no other on Earth. And if you go to another place, it will be a place like no other on Earth. And you'll start to see that this ability to create a story of place opens up a pathway into the future. And so, let's look at this with a concrete example. Oops, it jumped ahead. Come on back. I gotta do the whole thing again. It'd be better if I'm doing it so that I can move forward. I'll just keep moving around. Maybe if I stand on this side, it'll work better. Because what I want to do is look at this. This is Springfield, Eugene. North is that way. This is an image I took from Google Earth. And I just want you to notice, where are the patterns of degradation? They're really obvious, right? My daughter's 6 years old. She loves to draw. She would just draw them for us. There they are. They're in the valleys. Right? They're in the valleys. In the valleys where the agriculture is, where the deforestation has happened. there's a part here at the convergence of the Willamette and the Mackenzie, which is the urban center. But you can start to see what would you need to regenerate in this landscape. And then you look and notice, like this here is a drainage that's maybe 10 miles long by 2 or 3 miles wide. And you'll notice that that is a scale that is human for understanding, that you could imagine organizing and doing something like reforestation on something that size. So maybe there are 100 private pieces of land, 100 landowners. You go and talk with them. You invite them to town hall meetings, start to envision a future together. You imagine what kind of economy you want to have, start to think about where are the ecological corridors we need to create, which parts are really important just for ecological conservation, which parts are okay for human use, where should the density be for human presence, where should density not be for human presence. You can start to do a landscape plan. This is a human scale of organization. This is something that you could walk from one end to the other in a day, or maybe 2 days, or you could drive around on it and visit it and become intimate with it. If you worked in this valley for the span of 5 or 10 or 20 years, you would know its soil types with your fingers, right? You could become intimate with this scale. So what's interesting about this is the amount of degradation around a place like Eugene, Oregon, is organized already by the land into coherent patterns. And then you can start to organize around those coherent patterns. And then if we go up a scale, like here, I've turned the map around. Now north is this way. This is the Willamette Valley. You can see Portland and Eugene. And if you guys could see this image really well, the projector's not great, you would see that this is an incredibly degraded landscape. This is like a third of the state of Oregon. It's completely deforested. It's a total mess. Drive through the Willamette Valley at the right time of year, you'll see the dust devils of the soils just being lifted away. And if you were to ask, how would we ever regenerate something so large? And you might notice, just like on the previous image, that the patterns are already there. And I just drew a few of them in. Where you can see it's in the drainages, it's in the valleys, it's in the watersheds. And then you can imagine 20 or 30 or 40 parallel projects, each of them regenerating their own watersheds to regenerate the Willamette Valley. Because the land already knows how to structure itself. It's already got an organizing pattern. And then what's interesting about this is we can go one level higher. The Columbia River Basin. This thing's huge, by the way, 258,000 square miles, 174 entire watersheds that drain into it. It's actually about the same size as the Colorado Basin, which I just learned a few days ago. I was shocked. And then if you look, there's the Willamette Valley. And you start to see that there are these nested levels of reality. And how would we regenerate the entire Columbia Basin? Well, the same way. Let me just go back and show you. We go back here, okay. Locally, we'd organize around these things. We go up in scale, we'd organize around those. Then we go here, and then we just repeat throughout the different parts of the watershed. It's fractal. And so if you want to regenerate something as large as this, you just start organizing locally and creating clustering and creating collaboration between them and go up in scale. Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I just want to point out, it's kind of like reversing the story of the land, as it kind of started with deforestation from around the river as expanding out as people settled. And we're basically wanting to do the opposite.
Yeah, we go to the top of the watersheds, because that's what you do with watershed restoration. You go to the top, you start working your way down. And so you can see that all of the intelligence we need is in the shape of the land already. We just have to learn how to collaborate with the land. And then we could look out at the entire Cascadia bioregion, which is the Columbia Basin, together with the Salish Sea, organized around this backbone of the Cascade Mountain Range. And we'll see that this is a powerful way to organize local landscapes. And you can start to imagine a mycelial web of regeneration spreading across Cascadia. And so we're on this Regenerate Cascadia tour. It doesn't go to all of those dots, but it goes to quite a few of them. You can see that in the span of a month, we're going to visit a lot of places. If each of those places starts organizing the regeneration of their landscapes while collaborating with the other places, we begin to form a mycelial web. And some other people, like these guys down in the corner, might catch wind of what we're doing, and they start organizing themselves too. Organizing around their drainages and their watersheds, and their naturally occurring ecological patterns of landscapes. And then we begin to see how to regenerate Cascadia. To do this work, though, we need to have an understanding of how do we structure the regenerative work. How do the humans organize themselves to regenerate landscapes? And that's where we need to look at some structures of bioregional regeneration. And I'm just going to point out some of the main ones that absolutely need to be there. Again, we go back to the way that land is organized. How does land organize the humans? And one thing we need to organize is that story of place, which means we need to create bioregional learning centers. I'll talk a little bit more about what a bioregional learning center is. We have to have ecosystems of learning about our story of place, right? Education is fundamental to all of this. And then we need to cultivate territorial governance, because we have to be able to manage our own local affairs, to allocate our resources, to set our own priorities, to move toward our own agendas as local landscapes and as bioregions. And we can do this by creating tapestries of local projects, organized as landscapes, and creating ecosystems of learning. So I just walk through how that works. But to do all of that, this little thing down at the bottom, is we have to design for pro-social contexts, which is we have to design for shared identity and purpose, for the equitable allocation of contributions and benefits, for fair and inclusive decision-making, for fast and fair conflict resolution, for collaborative relations between groups, all these things that Eleanor Ostrom, for those of you who know her work, described for how to manage a commons. We have to design for pro-social contexts. And as we do that, we can say things like, well, here in this river, we would like to bring back the salmon, and we have a shared purpose. And in this way, we are the salmon people. We have a shared identity. And our shared identity and purpose, we start to say, so therefore, it is a priority for us to remove this dam or add a fish ladder, or to do other things that are criteria and objectives and priorities based on the purpose that brings us together. We need to be able to create these pro-social contexts so that we can guide ourselves toward collective outcomes. Bringing salmon back to the river is a collective outcome. It involves the collaboration of the salmon and the river and a lot of different multi-stakeholder groups who can represent that watershed. And so this brings us back to the idea of a bioregion, to look at it in a slightly different way. Because the word bioregion is often associated with political movements, back to the land, regional sovereignty, secessionist movements, for good reason. Very good reasons why that is. But there's a more basic way of thinking about it. So the bioregion is the geography of a biological region, which is another way of saying it is the space in which the entire life system of the species and their population can exist. So you look at a simpler example, like a starfish, say what is the bioregion for starfish? And it's the intertidal zone, right? Between the high tides and the low tides, where there are tide pools, you have the entire life system of starfish. Their food supply, their shelter, their ability to reproduce. Everything they need as a population is within that geography. Now with humans, it gets more complicated because you have to add in human culture, and you add in technology, models of social organization, type of economy, political structure, cosmovision and worldview, all these things. So bioregions for humans is quite a bit more complicated. But it still comes back to the spatial geography for the whole life system of the human culture. What this means is that each bioregion is actually the whole system model for regeneration. Because regeneration is those living processes that reproduce life and wellness and flourishing for the entire population. Another way of saying it is, it's actually a tautology to say that the only sustainable scale of human culture is a bioregion. Because a bioregion is the minimum spatial scale for the whole life system of the human population. So by definition, the only way to get to sustainable human cultures is to organize them as bioregions, is to organize them as holistic living systems, organized as landscapes. This should be obvious if you look at ancestral lands, because ancestral lands of indigenous peoples are always organized as territories, as regional geographic domains. And when you go to the scale of language families, where there can be multiple territories overlapping, you see extended trade networks, and you start to see these self-organizing patterns of bioregions, which is the sustainable human cultures from ancestral times. When we think in this way, we start to see the only way to get to planetary sustainability is to create a planetary network of bioregions. It's for humans to organize themselves everywhere on Earth that humans are going to exist in the form of bioregions. And then create exchanges between the bioregions so that we can learn how to do this, and so that we can have something that is the new and improved version of globalization, which is extended trade networks between bioregions. And then you can see, as Brandon likes to point out, that bioregions are the naturally occurring version of nation states. If there are to be any kind of nation states in the future that are therefore sustainable because they've lasted, it's because they organize themselves as bioregions, which is why it's completely stupid to divide the Salish Sea in half by the US-Canadian border. It makes no sense. Doesn't even make sense to the Canadians or the US, right? We're more friends with these people than those people on the other side of the continent. And that's because bioregions are real. Whether we politically recognize them as real or not, they are naturally occurring features of the planet. And humans organize themselves this way. So what needs to happen is this. We need to recreate the conditions for living locally in terms of material flows, integrated life systems with thriving families and communities. I like to use this map because this is a map of ecozones. These are types of ecosystems defined by soil, by climate, and by type of ecosystem. And the reason I like this map is each color is a different kind of ecozone. I just want you to notice there's more than one color, which is that we should expect a cultural diversity of human economies, a cultural diversity of human political systems. This should be expected because they should co-evolve with the kind of landscape that they are, which is what cultural evolution shows us actually happens. But that's why someone from Northern California feels more like they relate to British Columbia than to someone in Southern California. Because Humboldt County is more like British Columbia than it's like LA, for ecotypic reasons. And so, this leads to one of those little secrets, little spoilers, that the secret to planetary sustainability was figured out a long time ago. Some of you may remember a really famous study from 1972 called Limits to Growth. This is a computer simulation led by a group of researchers at MIT, where they were the first people to model the supply chains of the global economy and resource flows. And big surprise, the planet is finite. And eventually something that pretends finite limits don't exist is going to collapse. And so they had this business as usual scenario. That's actually where the phrase business as usual comes from, was the Limits to Growth study. And it was not a forecast, but damn have we been good at tracking it. Because if you look at the updates, the 40-year update and so on, we're like tracking business as usual so well it's scary. Because the human population in that simulation is going to peak around 2030, and it's going to start to rapidly decline around 2040. And then going to drop precipitously. And so that Limits to Growth study evoked a huge conversation. It was very controversial. Between 1972 and 1983, there was a group of people that called themselves the Balaton Group, because the first place they met was at Lake Balaton, the largest lake in Europe. It's in Hungary. So they called themselves the Balaton Group. And 10 years later, in 1983, Dana Meadows, the lead author of Limits to Growth, wrote an essay about the brief history of the Balaton Group. And this is a quote from that essay, where Vernon Rutten, who's an agroeconomist, said this. Said, each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. What's relevant is the transfer of the capacity to develop technology and institutions consistent with the cultural endowment and resource endowment of each region, which is each place needs to create its own way of managing itself appropriate to the place. And then Dana Meadows went on to say this, out of these 10 years of meetings at universities and research centers all over the world came a vision of a number of centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. there would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion. She was describing bioregional learning centers. This is an essay that came out in 1983. I was 6 years old in 1983. So in 1983, they said the only way to planetary sustainability is to organize ourselves as local living economies, organized as bioregions, and each one needs to have its own bioregional learning center. So have there been any better ideas for creating planetary sustainability than that since 1983? No. No. This is the only way. And what happened was in the mid-1980s, a group of people, sometimes they're called neoliberals, sometimes they're called the global cabal, anyways, a whole bunch of names. The names get less nice the more you know about them. That decided to turn the whole conversation into rational economic management based on methodological individualism, therefore consumer product purchases, to ensure that the whole conversation becomes a technocratic discussion of CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And we ignore everything else. It's not an accident that our environmental discourse ignores population, ignores consumption, like the climate discourse ignores biodiversity. It's insane. It's insane. And that is the mainstream discourse on purpose to hide that what we actually have to do is create local economies and local sovereignty and local governance and manage our local affairs. So I want to just walk you through a little example of how we're doing this in another place so you can start to see how you might do it here. This is a topographic map of Colombia. So these are the mountains of the northern Andes. I live right about here in a place called Barichara. And what you can see in that little colored in space is a well-defined regional climate system. Because there are tall mountains on the west and the air comes in from the west. And there are tall mountains on the east on both sides, and it creates an enclosed area where there's circulation of air on the scale of about 500,000 hectares or 1 million acres of land. And in that region is a unique type of ecosystem like no other on Earth called the High Andes tropical dry forest. About 80% endemic species, 8 out of 10 species exist nowhere else on Earth. And that forest is 95% deforested thanks to monoculture agriculture, and the whole region's becoming a desert. So the question becomes, how do you restore the regional climate system? How do you protect that unique ecosystem? How do you protect that biodiversity? And how do you create a bioregional scale economy appropriate to that place? So when I arrived there in 2019, I went to this place. This is Barichara. Its tourism name in Colombia is the prettiest town in Colombia, which is probably true because it's really beautiful there. And it is a place that has a lot of regenerative projects, including here in the foreground is Bioparque Moncora, which is a community reforestation project to create native forest. And so when I stood in this place, I was able to see the mixing patterns of cloud formation for the regional climate system. And so there are all kinds of things. There are mountains on all sides. It's really beautiful. And so in Barichara, there's a typical pattern of Colombia, which is after all of the violence of the last century, they're not very good at trusting each other. And so they don't know about each other's projects. So the gringo from the outside could come in and start weaving the projects and building trust that the local people weren't going to do on their own. Welcome to the ironies of reality. So I showed up in November of 2019 with my family, looking for a place to raise our daughter as part of landscape scale regenerative work. And I started finding the projects that people were doing locally that had a good track record of success. And started bringing them together to say, if we could weave a tapestry of these local projects, we could heal the landscape. So we want to create a design school for regeneration at the scale of eventually 500,000 hectares. We're starting closer to the town of Barichara and the local watersheds, but we're creating collaborative relationships with other places. And we're starting to organize at the landscape scale. We're organizing around 4 key patterns that can integrate at this territorial scale. I know this is a little difficult to read, so I'll summarize it for you. One of them is the restoration of entire watersheds. Because in Barichara, every single river is dead. They're dead. They've either completely dried up, and when it rains, it just runs off into the river below, or it's so contaminated that nothing can live in it. A typical story across most of Latin America and a lot of Africa and many other places. So that means we need to set up community water councils. We need to organize reforestation around watersheds to restore soils, to recharge aquifers, to reestablish ecological connectivity. And so we're organizing around watersheds. We've created a learning center in syntropic agroforestry, which is that we've set up 2 demonstration sites. We've offered several workshops. In the workshops, people who are private landowners start practicing reforestation on their land, and we have learning exchanges where with the instructors of syntropic agroforestry, they do field site visits to learn techniques like pruning or watersheds, or how to define the composition of plants that you're planting so that we can get really good reforestation, and it's being spread across the landscape. But because it's an agroforestry system, it's also for growing food, medicinal plants, textiles and natural fibers, and construction materials, which means we have the basis of a local economy in the reforestation work. And that leads to the third pattern, which is the transformation of local food systems. In Barichara, we're really lucky because 70% of the food consumed in the town is grown within 10 kilometers of the town. Most places are lucky to get to 3%. Cities are screwed. The food sheds of cities show you how unsustainable cities are. But within 10 kilometers, we grow about 70% of our food in a deforested area becoming desert, which means with good, smart reforestation, we can create a sustainable food web. Now, Barichara has only got a population of about 6,000 people. If you add the small villages and areas around, it's about 15,000 people. So it's a really different scale, but it's a living prototype of how to do this. And then the fourth thing we're doing is designing alternative economic models. Things like bringing together the producers and creating a cooperative local store. Doing things like creating a community fund, prototyping of a community currency, building solidarity exchanges based on trust and not based on money, doing trauma healing as it relates to local economic activities so people can trust each other better. Lots of things related to alternative economic models. And you can see how they all feed each other to create territorial scale patterns to birth a regenerative economy. And one of the pieces of this that's really powerful is that at the heart of it all is a different way of educating children. Very different way of educating children. I want to just talk briefly about Felipe, who's here in this guy's sitting here with a little goatee. Felipe created a project called Caminatas del Agua, which is the water walks, where he would take children, he'd get permission from landowners, and they would walk across people's private land following the pathways of the dead rivers and streams. And when they would meet the landowners, the children, who were between the ages of 4 and 10, the children would interview the adults about what happened to the water. And the adults would have to say things like, "Que pena." I was like, what a shame. We cut down the forest, we fought with our neighbors, and the water went away. We destroyed this land. And it starts to build conscience in the adults. And as the children start talking about how to restore the watershed, here they're in a group called Pasos de Agua, which is the steps that water takes. They walk with the water. They're trying to restore the drainage of the Barichara River, which is one of the dead rivers in our region. And they bring together experts in permaculture and reforestation and watershed restoration. Then we also bring in, like this is an indigenous elder from the Muisca culture near Bogota, bringing spiritual guidance and a reassurance to the kids. And then the kids offer their own policy proposals and solutions. This is Quetzal. She's 7 now, but when this picture was taken, she was 6. And what Quetzal is doing is presenting her ideas to restore the Barichara River. You can't read them, but my favorite one of her ideas is let's gather straw bales and let's inoculate them with mushrooms and put them in the river and do micro-remediation to clean the contaminants out of the water. So 6-year-old Quetzal knows how to watch YouTube and learn about micro-remediation. So when you have children who are empowered by the adults and the adults actually listen and say, wait, you want to do what? Oh, I can help you with that. Let's go look that up. Oh, you need some materials? Let's go gather them. Oh, you need someone who knows how to do that? Let's go talk to them. And these kids are feeling empowered to transform our watershed. I want to comment on another thing. In this other picture, that's Gabriela, and that's her granddaughter, Soraya. One of the things that we really care about in Barichara is a principled position that whenever it's possible that the adults are having an important conversation, we have the children playing right in the center of the circle. So that when these kids grow up, they're going to know what the adults were talking about, and the adults are going to live with the integrity of their choices by having it mirrored to the people who they're going to affect with the decisions they make today. And this completely transforms how we talk about things like the watersheds or the future. So there's so much we can do with education by having education work in really different ways. Now, what's interesting about this work is that when you look at something like that, this is that Bioparque Moncora. It's a 6.5 hectare community reforestation project. It's a beautiful space. Everyone loves it. And right next to it is Fundación Monte Chico, where they practice the preservation of cultural knowledge around natural fibers, textiles, and bioconstruction. And they bring in experts to teach middle schoolers how to do bioconstruction and textiles. When I arrived in 2019, they weren't talking to each other, and they didn't know about each other's projects. Now, you can walk from here to there in about 5 minutes on a little trail. So for me as the outsider to show up and be like, you guys are neighbors, and you care about pretty much the same thing, and you're not collaborating? And so what's interesting is how easily collaboration can occur when things are next to each other in the landscape. And so if we look at something like this, these are some of the projects that we work with, which is say local projects led by local people. One of the things I do is help mobilize outside resources for them to be able to do things and collaborate. We're creating a territorial kind of governance with a community foundation we're creating. But when we look at this, we're like, oh, there are all these different projects. You don't have to know what they all are. But I'll just name a couple examples. Here's Cane Colibri, which is community theater, where they bring in indigenous people and do theatrical performances to teach children Northern Andes cosmovision and nature connection. Here's Corosoma, which is healer women who create circles of women to deal with domestic violence and other kinds of cultural trauma. Here's Huerta Comunitaria, Huerta Mi Sol is what its name is, which is 16 families working on building food security by growing their own food together, and also the site of one of our syntropic agriculture demonstration sites. When you look at these different projects, the way I've outlined them here, you're like, how do they relate to each other? You can't really tell. Like, they might be thematically related, but should they work together? What should they prioritize? How could they do it? But when you look at them on a map, you start to see things like, oh, Cane Colibri, the community theater, is over here. Agua Santa, which is down here, is actually they're in a drainage that comes together like this. And then there are other regenerative agriculture projects. And there's a community group called Cazadores de Semillas, which is children who gather seeds and do watershed restoration, protect water on their land, which is working with some of the teachers in this rural countryside. And why should they all work together? Well, because they're in the same drainage. They can actually restore the same, what they call microcuenca, which is just the Spanish word for stream, small creek. And so the landscape tells them how to organize. And you start to say, well, maybe what we should prioritize is a program for that drainage, and then proactively create curriculum with the kids, and proactively build regenerative agriculture cooperatives around the watershed. And then you start to see how to organize the regeneration of the landscape. So this leads us back to bioregional learning centers. What is a bioregional learning center? How is this different from other kinds of education? What does a bioregional learning center do? It does a lot more than what I'm going to say here, but I want to give a couple of illustrative functions. One thing it does is it's the coordination of learning processes. Here in this region, you have a lot of learning activities already happening. Where you got things at the university, you got conservation groups. Yesterday, Thomas took us to a really nice nature reserve in Beaverton, where they do eco-literacy with the kids. You know, there are all these learning processes, probably thousands of them around Portland, a lot of them. But they're not very well coordinated around landscapes. So the Bioregional Learning Center is the place that maps out and identifies the different learning processes relevant to the place and begins creating coordination among them. to help them integrate together. Which means they do a lot of mapping and a lot of knowledge sharing. Like there's a lot of knowledge about this place, but where is it? Is it organized? Are there inventories of it? Is it pedagogically organized where it's learnable? Who's doing that work? The coordination of this is what a bioregional learning center can do. It's also the gateway into community activities. So as you show up in the community and you're like, I'm really interested in social and emotional development of children and nature connection. Oh, go talk to these people. I'm really interested in reforestation and I love trees. Oh, go talk to those people. I'm a farmer and I'm really interested in soil building and sustainable food systems. Go talk to these people. If you have an entry gateway, like a help desk or like a reference desk at a library that helps you navigate the system, this is for outsiders who arrive at your bioregion, but also people in your own community. They're like, so I want to go learn about this. Oh, well, we've organized it. We've already been coordinating it. So you show up here. That's why it's a bioregional learning center. The center is that there's one place to go to begin, one entry portal. Now, you might have multiple portals to the entry portal. The usability designers know those tricks. But basically, it's like a funnel. You bring them into convergence with each other. So there's a more complicated version, but it's basically the same. It's a gateway in. This includes advanced modeling and simulation like you'd find at universities and national laboratories. Like, say, if there's a group that's studying plate tectonics and earthquake risk, or if there's a group that's studying changing precipitation patterns and land use as it relates to deforestation and agriculture, or whatever it may be. They're looking at tidal patterns or tsunami risk with earthquakes, and they're doing computer simulation. All of that can become part of what is coordinated into a bioregional learning center, which means universities fundamentally change, which they need to because they're dying and they're basically dinosaurs. But the advanced modeling and simulation, your satellite remote sensing, your sensor networks, your computer simulation, your scientific visualization, all those things for the complexity of this kind of work, they have a place too. So it can very much be hippie permaculture, bless hippie permaculture, but it can also be advanced scientific research and modeling. It's all of it together. It's all of it together. And indigenous perspectives and the decolonization of education. It can come into harmony. The Bioregional Learning Center can be an anchoring place for the sovereignty of First Nations people to bring the part that they bring in a mutually respectful way with others who are from settler cultures that arrived into the community. And it's both centralized and decentralized, just like your brain, right? It's got centralizing components like coordination on databases and inventories and whatever, but it's also decentralized because that is coordinating the parallel evolving processes that are happening across the community. And now you can start to feel how a bioregional learning center becomes an ecosystem of learning that can be very diverse. It can include prenatal care. It can include visioning of the future, strategic planning, economic development. All kinds of things can be included. And similarly, when we look at territorial governance, we can see, well, so how does this work? How does territorial governance work? For one thing, you start to map and weave local projects, which is something that Brandon's going to talk about after I'm done, is bioregional mapping. Mapping and weaving local projects is governance. Why? Because how do you map those projects? You have to go and talk to the people who have the projects and learn what those projects are. They have to be willing to share the information. What happens as you map the projects? You start to talk about collaboration, which includes decision making, right? And this is how you can begin to identify needs and priorities together across the projects. And then you can start to form landscape partnerships, multi-stakeholder groups that care about the landscapes as a whole, like the way that fisheries are managed, like the way that rivers are managed, right? Start to form landscape partnerships, which is as we map and weave projects, set priorities, those priorities become managed and manifested through landscape partnerships. This means we need to create community funding structures. Why? Because who knows best how to allocate the resources in the community? The people of the community who know what's going on. And so you end up creating collaborative and participatory funding structures, and not just for money. You can totally go multi-capital on this. This is for knowledge, this is for institutions, this is tool sharing, this is time banking, this is anything of value that might flow within the community. And it allows you to mobilize the resources in service to the whole, where the whole might be a watershed. It might be the Columbia Basin, it might be the Salish Sea, but whatever scale it is, there is actually whole system management with multi-stakeholder representation. And the resource flows are managed in service to that whole system and its health. This is where you integrate something like agriculture with forestry, with fisheries, with water, and a watershed. You start working at the level of whole system health. This cultivates local sovereignty, because local sovereignty is we manage our own resources and make our own decisions. There's a beautiful word, subsidiarity, which is basically make your decisions as close to where the action happens as you can and still have the decision be effective. Which is you don't go up in scale unless you have to. If it can be managed by an individual, do it at the individual level. If it's managed by a family, do it at a family level. If it can be managed at a neighborhood level, do it at a neighborhood level. So that you keep the decisions as close to the real knowledge and real practical know-how and capacity as you can. It's called subsidiarity, which means as you start to practice territorial governance in this way, local sovereignty emerges. And this strengthens internal collaboration, it strengthens internal coherence. It creates a coherent economic development framework that is locally based and locally constituted by local people. And this leads to a really nice schematic diagram that I stole, really I made my own cartoon version of, from an organization called Common Land Foundation. Common Land Foundation is based in Amsterdam, founded by a man named Willem Verweerda, who's a tropical ecologist. At one point, he was the director of IUCN, which is the Global Conservation Organization for Biodiversity. And he noticed for a really long time that there are all these great conservation projects, but as soon as the funding runs out, cue the chainsaws. Because once the funding runs out, the project ends, people come in and destroy the ecosystem and extract from it. And he realized, I think other people realized it too, that we need process funding instead of project funding, because we need to maintain key processes that basically never end, which is really different from, we got 5 years of funding for our project, yay, but what happens on year 6? And by the way, years 2, 3, and 4 are trying to find more funding so that on year 6 you can keep going, which basically destroys the efficacy of projects at all scales. And so what he did was he started trying to figure out how do we fund the regeneration of landscapes at the scale of 100,000 hectares or larger for 20 years or longer. First thing that he noticed was that the people who had the money to fund this were ecological idiots. They're nice people, but they don't know ecology. So you can't talk to them about ecology. It's like, whew, they don't get it. So he had to create really simple language, really simple things they could understand. So he's like, we're going to need hundreds of millions of dollars to regenerate this watershed or to create this regional regenerative agriculture system. We need hundreds of millions of dollars. Are there any other situations where people mobilize hundreds of millions of dollars for a project? Yes, they're called infrastructure projects. For example, you guys have a nice regional transit system here in Portland, right? It's pretty good. It's got its problems, but how much did it cost to build that railway system? $1 billion? Something big, right? And how did they do it? They created a project management framework for 20 or 30 years. They allocated millions of dollars of funding to the core management team to be sure all the key processes were done. Things like contracting, resourcing, being sure legal issues are handled well. And these are processes that they have to maintain during the lifetime of the project. So that means that you need to fund a core team that manages the project. If you do this at the scale of a landscape, you need to fund the core team that is managing the integration of landscape processes. And so Common Land Foundation is now working in about 25 landscapes. They started in 2012. One of their biggest landscapes and one of their oldest is in Andalusia in Spain. It's about 1 million acres of land. that was completely destroyed by 5,000 years of Roman agriculture. It's become desert, and they're trying to create regenerative agriculture and restore the local economy. This is the kind of place where they will gift you a big mansion if you will agree to stay in the ghost town where everyone left because the economy collapsed. It's in that part of Spain. Or it's in one of those parts of Spain because there's more than one. And so they have demonstrated this model in practice in about 10 landscapes so far with more than 10 years of data. And so they're starting to build up the story. How do you convince funders to fund these things? And what they found was 100,000 hectares or larger, 20 years or longer, large scale. You need at least $2 million a year for your core team. Just do the math. 2 million, 20 years, $40 million. If it goes up to 3 million, we're talking about 75, 60 million. So we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. And then this green area is that there are all these regenerative projects that are actually operating in a really beautiful way that economists call public goods. Public goods are the things you invest in because they generally benefit the whole society. As an example, education. If you don't have an educated workforce, you don't really have much of a workforce. So we bring in taxpayer money and we fund education, and education is a public good. It benefits the society as a whole. Now, yeah, neoliberalization of universities and all that stuff has basically extracted and destroyed that in many forms of education, but education is an easy example of public good. Another one would be health. If I'm over here sick and coughing all the time, you all are going to get sick. You would want to invest in me being healthy to keep all of you healthy. So public goods, this is a well-known thing in economics. It turns out our regenerative projects are public goods. They're doing things like building soils. They're doing things like creating relationships of trust. They're creating a huge amount of knowledge. And that means we need, usually with philanthropic investment, because other forms of investors don't understand this model, is we have to invest, look at the size, at least twice as much, $4 or $5 million, $6 million per year in all of the regenerative projects in our landscape. And with the core team, weave them together coherently as landscape processes. And you know what happens when you do that? After 8 to 10 years, your regenerative businesses become viable. So if you think you're going to have a successful regenerative business without a supportive ecosystem, that's just foolish. It doesn't work that way. But if you have all of this infrastructure, all this public goods infrastructure, like let's say that you have really good farmers markets and a network of regenerative farms, and they're connected to university extension, which is connected to universities, which is connected to research funding, and now you have an integrated supply chain that can build the economy in the direction of the food system you need, then it starts to enable regenerative businesses and regenerative markets to work. So what they found in their experience is it's usually 8 to 10 year time delay before you have effective and successful regenerative businesses. By the way, this is sometimes called the gap of death or the valley of death in investments. Any of you who are entrepreneurs who create startups, you have this really beautiful thing, but you can't scale it. It's because you have to float the money as where angel investment and the seed funding and all that stuff. This is the valley of death. And this is your regenerative economy, which means you have to make investments in public good infrastructure until it evolves enough to be self-stabilizing. And only then do you have a tax base of profits that local governments can actually allocate money to support the regenerative economy based on their tax base. And then you have a regenerative economy that's working. What's beautiful about this is that this is the funding model for an infrastructure project, which means large-scale investors understand the language of this. You go to them and say, I need $100 million to start. We're going to create a regenerative food system in Spain. And they're like, you're crazy. And you're like, no, we have a project management team. We've been identifying the kinds of projects we need. We know how to create a market. We know the time lags it takes. We're starting to work with local governments and putting things in place so the policy framework will be conducive. And they're like, oh, I can invest in that. It's just showing the scale that's needed. The scale that's needed is something like this. This is how you create different kinds of economic systems. And actually, it's a bargain to spend $100 million building a regional economy. And so people who get this are now putting money into regenerative projects at scale, which is a useful thing to know. And that leads to a beautiful phrase that my friend Stuart Cowan came up with. Stuart's supposed to be here. I don't know where he is. Bioregional investment platforms. A bioregional investment platform is a portfolio of projects organized around a specific landscape where you create interactions between them so that you can manage the risks of some projects not working, or maybe what was learned gets leveraged into another project by funding an ecosystem of projects. Bioregional investment platforms. What we're doing in Barichara is we've created a community foundation that coordinates the flow and does the convening of multi-stakeholder groups and is guiding the creation of the regional economic system. But it works basically like this. You have your bioregional learning center that's organizing all of the education. You have a territorial foundation or some kind of territorial governance that's coordinating around decision making, agenda setting, priorities, mobilization of resources. You have a portfolio of local projects, and you have all these pro-social capacities between them, of them collaborating and working together. And as you do this, you have a fundamental instrument. You have a financial instrument to put money into that will create regenerative economies, and you can measure their impact. And so, to summarize, the structures you need for bioregional regeneration is bioregional learning centers, territorial governance, integrated landscape management, which is the weaving together of projects to landscape scale. And these create robust circulation of value flow between them and all of their interactions. It's actually really hard to tell where one ends and the other one begins in practice. So let these circles be soft on their edges. And so in more human terms, this means that we weave the people and projects around a shared vision at the landscape scale to grow their cooperative abilities, to work together at landscape scale. This deepens their organizing capacities. They actually build new ways of organizing. And then you birth the regenerative economy, which is organized at the scale of the living systems of the region. So you can see in Cascadia, there are a lot of natural patterns that we could do this within. These are the major watersheds of the Salish Sea. Don't you think we could do that in the Kinsam, in the Nanaimo, in the Cowichan, and so on? You start to see that these naturally occurring patterns are a way of building a regenerative economy. What's interesting is when you look at this map and then jump to this map, this is the map of the language families of First Nations people. You see that they don't overlap exactly, but they overlap significantly because language families are the measures of regional trade, of economic exchange, which requires shared language. Well, it doesn't require it, but it sure works a lot better. So they tend to evolve into pidgin languages and shared languages and so on. And so you can start to see that it's not an accident that the language families broadly correspond with watersheds. They're not reducible to them, but they do correspond with them because the natural patterns of landscapes set constraints on how economic exchange can happen in the absence of fossil fuels, which is almost all of history before the 1800s, and it'll be all of the history after the 21st century because we're running out and we shouldn't be using them the way we are anyway. So you can start to see that the indigenous cultures have a lot to teach us about how to do this because they've already been doing it for a lot longer than we have. But also, they need what we bring, and this is a really important lesson. I work with a lot of indigenous leaders, and the ones who really get the planetary context we're in, they know that we're not going to find the solutions from indigenous culture. But they also know we're going to find a lot of things from indigenous culture that we need. And so we actually need to bring together the best of traditional ecological knowledge and wisdom traditions with the best of science and technology. And the best is that which is regenerative. Lots of problems on the slippery slopes of tech. But how could we do this today without satellites, without sensor networks, without knowledge of aquifer systems? We've degraded them so badly that they can't regenerate on their own and protect humans from extinction. They might regenerate on their own, but they won't really care about our time frames very much. So if we're going to do this, we have to create deep collaboration. I love the way that the Kogis talk about it. The Kogi people are from the Tairona civilization. They live in Santa Marta de Sierra Nevada, and that is in the northern part of Colombia. They have a beautiful way of reframing the phrase third world. Because I say the first world is the ancestral wisdom traditions of First Nations people, going back to the beginning of humans. The second world is modernity, science and technology, this time that we're in now. The third world, which has never existed before for anyone, is the bringing together of the first and the second worlds to create the very first planetary indigenous cultures, which never needed to exist before. They never needed to exist, but they need to exist now. And that's why we're creating something new. And so this is where you can start to see the rhyme and the reason of our Regenerate Cascadia activation tour. Started a week ago today in the Columbia River. A couple of the last few days we were in Eugene. Now we're in Portland. The track doesn't quite follow the way this image is. From Portland on Wednesday we go to Olympia. After Olympia we go to Vashon Island, then to Seattle, then to Whidbey Island, then to Port Townsend and Fort Worden, then to Victoria on Vancouver Island, then to Gabriola Island, and then to Bellingham and Skagit Valley, and then back to Seattle. We're not covering all of Cascadia, but we're not doing a bad job in 30 days. And the idea is to have the same conversation in every place and build connectivity between them. And we're not just doing this in Cascadia, because this needs to happen at a planetary scale. So back in January, Penny and I went and started this process in the Great Lakes. We were invited to the Greater Takaranto Bioregion in southern Ontario, to the Finger Lakes and Genesee River in upstate New York, and to the Cuyahoga River in northeastern Ohio. And we started this pattern of parallel conversations in different communities around the regeneration of the Great Lakes, a process that's continuing and is going to move toward Regenerate the Great Lakes Summit in January. Then, in May and June, we went from the headwaters of the Colorado River to the Sea of Cortez, where the water no longer reaches the sea. I don't know if you know that the delta of the Colorado River used to be the most biodiverse river delta on Earth. And in 1967, they closed Glen Canyon Dam and they turned Baja California into a desert. Killed it. The only time the water has reached the sea is 2 times they experimentally opened the floodgates to let more water through, which was in the last 10 years. It's dead. The Kukupa people who live right here, fishing people, no fish. It's sand dunes, like extreme desert. And so we started a learning exchange between the headwaters and the delta. They had a leadership retreat about 2 weeks ago of landscape leaders from the different communities that Penny and I visited as we were giving talks and moving through the area, planting the seed of regenerating the Colorado a couple months ago. And then here we are in Cascadia. You can start to see how you regenerate a continent, because we have conversations starting in the Ogallala and the Driftless region, things that can start to move toward regenerating the Mississippi River Basin, which is about 40% of the continental United States. And we start to see the patterning of how to regenerate continents. So we can do this on every continent. And we might give Antarctica a pass. It's a little joke I like to make. We can pick the other continents for now. I don't have to do it on every continent. But wouldn't this be a good thing to do in Africa and South America and Asia and Europe and Australia? And that's why we created the Design School for Regenerating Earth that started in March. This is how we describe what we're doing. People all over the world are gathering to regenerate the Earth, the bioregional scale, organized in a planetary network of learning exchanges between landscapes. So what we're doing is we are activating a planetary network of bioregional regeneration. Now, we're not the only ones doing this. Stephen and I were chatting at the beginning. They're doing it. Buckminster Fuller Institute's doing it. Transition USA is starting to do it. Other groups are starting to do it. So a lot of people have gotten the message this is the only game in town. Not our game, but the game of building a planetary network of bioregions. And so, there's my book. I have it in the back from the once when it tells the story of how to do this. But more importantly, you all right now are part of living out the design pathway for regenerating Earth that I wrote about in my book. Because the way we do it is connect communities around bioregional processes. And so if you have friends that are further along on our tour, send them to regeneratecascadia.org, and we'll meet with them in any of the future stops. What I want to do right now is I want to pass it over to Brandon to just talk a little bit about Regenerate Cascadia, and then we can have some discussion. Because I want to stress that this isn't Joe giving a talk and then we leave, because that's not going to change the world. We're actually organizing and working on follow through, and so there's a lot that you might like to know about. Oh, yeah, and you'll need, and he's going to have a mic that makes no sound, but it'll allow the live stream to pick up the recording. Do you want me to move the slides for you?
Sure.
Cool.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us here today and for the Portland stop of the Regenerate Cascadia tour. I think one of the most important things about this event is that this is not the end. The point of Regenerate Cascadia and this stop is not this talk or even these few days, though it's going to be wonderful and it's great to meet everybody and connect and network. But really, we want it to be the start. So it's not just the activation tour, but it's what comes after. And it's how we kind of weave our connections into the future. So what does this mean for Portland? The first thing is that just as Joe and Penny are doing an amazing job weaving a planetary network of bioregions across North America and the world, our job is to take that same principle and apply it here. So how do we build Cascadia as a node in this interconnected planetary network of bioregions and frameworks? And specifically, how do we build a core team for Portland? And what's great is that the answer to that question is right here. And that starts in this room with everybody who's gathered here. And from these conversations, you can map and weave, and just as important as who's here today is who's not here today. What voices are missing? What projects and communities are important for regenerative work that we need to connect with, and that Portland and the Willamette Valley needs to connect with as part of all of these conversations. And I think that's our real challenge and our real discussion. And when we start to identify these and build a map, then the real work of creating governance and funding can really start. And that conversation happens on a watershed scale, it happens on an eco-regional scale, and then it happens at the scale of bioregions and continents and planets and all the rest of that. So, if yeah,
We'll get there.
yeah. So, if you're interested, the most important thing you can do is, I think Quinn was passing around an email sign-up sheet. We'll also have another email sign-up sheet at the back table if you missed it. Please feel free to come talk to any of us. If you're with the Portland organizing team who helped put on this amazing event, maybe would you raise your hands for just a moment? Absolutely. So Michael, Thomas, Kirsten, Quinn, Sean down low.
That's Sean standing up.
Yeah. So these are the amazing people who helped organize this event. There's also going to be a gathering tonight, kind of an after party, 7 to 10, at the Haven. And then on Tuesday, there's going to be a whole nother series of events, work party at the Tryon State Park and then the Tryon Community Family Farm. All of that information can be found on the website regeneratecascadia.org, or you should definitely just talk to Quinn or Sean or any of these other folks, and they can give you more information.
And then tomorrow is Indigenous Peoples Day, and there's a whole bunch of different events going on in Portland and nearby. Share some of those with y'all, and we'd love to see you there.
Absolutely. So let's make sure to do that a little bit later today. And then, so basically our next steps are that we're going to be putting together these core teams in every watershed that we travel to. We're going to have follow-up meetings with these core organizers to start to kind of create the vision. The organizers will put together their own in-person events that'll hopefully happen in the next month. And then we're inviting everybody to come and meet each other as part of an online bioregional summit, November 3rd through 12th. The first weekend will be an opportunity for presentations, discussions, workshops. If you're in this room, you're probably connected to some type of amazing regenerative work that's happening, and we want to give space for all of you to share what those projects might be. And then during the week, we'll have theme discussions. That'll be things like digital tools and technology, community art, regenerative finance. They'll have panel discussions and then open community spaces where we really focus on how can each of these things be used to regenerate the bioregion. And then in that last weekend, that's really going to be space for the watershed teams to give their own presentations, really start to explore their own stories of place, and then also meet each other. Because while we're in these communities, we're only here for like a day or two. It's a very short window, and it's a wonderful start. But now we want to give space to really breathe and start to plan together for what happens in the upcoming weeks, months, years, and how we kind of work together. The real question is not just these tours, but it is about governance. It's about how do we work together, how do we make decisions, and how do we finance that. Yeah, if you're not familiar with myself, I guess I should just give a brief introduction. My name is Brandon. And so I'm the founder of Cascadia Now. It's an organization I started in 2005. I stepped away from that organization in 2016. And then more recently in 2019, we started an organization called the Department of Bioregion. And really, the purpose of the Department of Bioregion is very similar to Joe. When Joe and I met, we kind of just had this like weird interlocking connection because our mission is a world of bioregions and bioregional movements, and so we felt some alignment and synergy happening there. And so specifically here in Cascadia, we also really want to make sure we want to build the Cascadia social movement, but we want to make sure that any time the word Cascadia is being used, it's connected with bioregionalism and the principles and values and then the bioregion that goes with that in a way that is really defined. It can't be co-opted. It can't be taken. More than that, we always got these questions of what are the other bioregions of the world? We'd get people from Ontario, from Appalachia, and they go, what bioregion am I in? And we went, that's a really good question. What bioregion are you in? So that's really kind of what we really wanted to move towards, and so we are a 501c3. We work to educate, and we are excited to invite Joe and Penny and the design school in for this activation tour. And on that note, I would just also like to say that it's been amazing to see how this event has come together. I think in April of this year, there were 4 people who were planning this event, and that was myself, Claire, Joe, Penny. And then maybe in August of this year, about a month ago, there were 50 people in 14 different cities helping plan this event. And I think now, as of our latest count, we're up to about 140 people in 14 different cities helping to plan this event and what comes after, and helping us build a movement map. All right. And so, yeah, standard donation plug. If you like what we do think about donating. We're not being paid to be here. We are here because we actually just believe in this idea, in these values. We love what we do. And so if you like what you do, please feel free and donate. There's a donation jar on the back table. There's a QR code. That'll help support Regenerate Cascadia. If you want to support Joe and Penny, buy a book. They're pretty good. And then also, as Quinn was saying,
There is some paperweights too.
yeah, they look really good on that bookshelf. You know, make your friends look you look smart. And then, as Quinn was saying, do think about donating if you're able to. Suggest a donation that helps cover the space and the food for today. They've done an amazing job securing this. And then, on that note, I think in terms of our schedule, rather than having another presentation, lunch is actually ready. So probably after this presentation, we'll get some food and maybe hang out and can talk, and maybe Joe can sit a little context, but we can actually have some tasty nourishment. And then, what else do I got?
Next slide.
Yeah, give me another slide.
There you go.
Cool. All right, well, this is all pretty standard. So just to go back to it, how do we grow this Cascadia node? How do we create a bioregional investment platform that is a portfolio of all of the different landscape leadership teams, projects, communities that can weave this together? I'm gonna wait for a second. Okay. That's right. But the most important thing is that we are building a framework on a watershed, ecoregion, and bioregional scale where that funding can be allocated by the actual communities themselves, defined by their own needs. And then we create that framework which can kind of help be that kind of funnel.
One more?
And then lastly, how do we grow in Portland as part of this bioregional network? And that will be up to all of you. And then next. And then lastly, I'll just kind of, I want to give a call back. And for those who aren't familiar, this idea of Cascadia has been around for many, many decades, for more than 40 years. And it was really solidified at the first Cascadia Bioregional Congress, which happened on a nice sunny day in July of 1986 at Evergreen State College. And here, more than 150 people met over the course of that weekend to explore new ways of governance, new ways of thinking about our regions. And from this, the Cascadia Bioregional Movement was born. So now, 40 years later, I want to challenge everybody sitting in this room to think about how can we do the same thing? How can we build a regenerative framework for our communities, for our watersheds, and for our bioregion? And that's what I'd love us all to think about and answer. So, thank you.
So, I know I didn't make any time for like questions after my talk. I don't need it. I got this. Oh yeah. So if there are any questions, like to ask you speaking into the mic just so that it's captured for the video recording. So and then we can pass this one up. Please. Oh, good.
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of not questions, but well, I guess questions.
Or
One
however
was
you- however
one you
you'd
brought
like
up
to
the
do it.
Kogi people. I was going to ask you, did you have any interrelations or interactions with the Kogi people of Colombia? And then the other one that I was going to ask was, have you guys thought about connecting with the Grange Halls, which is, before the Boloton group, the Grange Halls were kind of doing that kind of stuff, even though they were pro-industrial, agricultural, and stuff like that. Not completely, but we have now green Grange Halls. Anyway, I'm going to let you answer one of those questions.
Well, I mean, the Grange is similar to Rotary International and other kinds of groups that when we actually look at community organizing, there are long histories, and a lot of you young whippersnappers may be less familiar with it. But actually, there's a long history of creating learning spaces for back in the days when people would just pass through from town to town and weave exactly these kinds of conversations. I maybe want to speak about not just the Kogis, but I can speak a little about the Kogis, is that for one thing, the Kogis are currently, there's a group of Kogi elders in Colorado right now working with some of the people we collaborated with after the Landscape Leaders Retreat we had 2 weeks ago with language translation to help them to speak with the Ute people, the indigenous people of that region. And of course, those of you who don't know, the Ute people are the ones who are still very pissed about the way they've been treated. They don't like talking to white people very much. It was like in the 1890s that Colorado became a state by stealing it from them. So it's a really tense thing. But to have these exchanges between indigenous groups that are like chaperoned or supported by those who you might say are non-indigenous, I'm always cautious about erasing the indigenous history of every human. But because we all are, all of my ancestors were indigenous up till a point that my great-grandparents became victims of genocide. And so it's interesting to note that there's a lot of healing happening because landscapes are speaking to landscapes with human support. And so the Ute are the people of like the central Rocky Mountains into the deserts in Utah and into the plains on the eastern side. Those extended networks of semi-nomadic peoples. For them to be talking with the Kogis is just a sign of the times. It's like we're in a time where we need to be gathering the indigenous knowledge that will otherwise be lost with the rest of human knowledge if humans go extinct. And so we're in a time where this is getting really serious. And what I would say, maybe less about the Kogis specifically, is I want to step back and say where Barichara is located. Because Barichara is, as you saw on the map, it's in that place where the Andes sort of go this way and then make a sharp turn toward Panama. What you probably don't know if you haven't spent much time in the Andes is that there were three major like patterns of, I don't know if you call them civilization or complex social structure. They have a shared language family called Chibcha. And the Chibcha language family includes the Kogis. It includes the Guane people, which are the people of Barichara, the Muisca, which are centered around Bogota. And there is an extensive trade network of stone paths going through the mountains from the Caribbean coast, where the Kogis are, through the mountains, right through Guane, the town where the Guane people would all be if they weren't all so successfully genocided. Some of them are still there, but it's a tattered mess. And then connected through to the Muisca people, which then connects through a place called San Agustin, which is on the border with Ecuador, which then connects to the Quechua-speaking peoples, which are the indigenous from before, during, and after the Incas. And of course, there are many languages and many names given, but there was an extensive trade network. And then once you get to that area around Panama, you start to see the Mayans got down to Costa Rica. And then you learn about interesting things like the peace pipe of North America. Where did that tobacco come from? It's indigenous to the northern Andes, because tobacco is the sacred grandfather plant to hold the lineages of our male ancestors as a way of building peace between people, because it tends to be the men who make war. So men sitting in council on a peace pipe is a way of building peace. So the peace pipe of North America is a gift from the people like the Guanes. And also the Guane people were famous for their cotton textiles. Cotton that's from the northern Andes. And so you start to see these very interesting patterns of cultural exchange going back at least 10,000 years. And you start to see continental patterns, in this case, transcontinental patterns. And for me, living in Latin America for the last 4 years, I've got to say they have a hell of a lot more to teach us than we have to teach them. The agroecology systems that exist in South America are astonishing. Colombia is a body of landscapes that is unconquerable. 500 years after the psychopath that gave the country its name arrived, Cristobal Columbus, 500 years later, there are still 78 intact languages and cultures of indigenous people, fully intact in the northern Andes and in the Amazon in Colombia, because the landscapes are unconquerable. So there's a huge amount of knowledge from there. You go to Mesoamerica, same thing. If you don't know about the Milpa, for example, these incredible systems. That's an 8,000-year food system, by the way. Still around. Plenty of people in Mexico and Honduras and Belize and Guatemala that'll teach you about it. And so what I keep finding is those people have so much to learn, teach the rest of the world. And a lot of the renaissance of culture is actually going to come from South America. And you can see that with like ayahuasca and its connection to ceremony and spiritual, but this goes much bigger. It's much bigger. So here we are in a trade network of peoples that created potlatch. There's so much abundance here with the salmon and with the hunting in these forests that they could make lodge poles, hunter-gatherers in permanent settlements. Where does that happen? Oh, here. You have to have pretty incredible abundance for that. When you get over to the Great Lakes, the Algonquin-speaking peoples have seashells from the Gulf of Mexico because they traded through canoes all the way up and down the Mississippi River. They had continental trade networks. And so this bioregional future is much more exciting than it seems. It's not that we hunker down in our little hole and, try and protect ourselves with little pea shooters sticking out of the windows. It's something really different. And so the Kogis are only one group of many. They're very well known because they, for those you don't know, they hid up in the mountains for 300 years and waited until the rivers, in this case the rivers of air that brought the water to restore the rivers, what they call the invisible golden thread of consciousness. When those threads started breaking down, they knew it was time to come down and bring a message to little brother, which they did in the 90s. There's a great documentary you can find online called Aluna about that. But this pattern of exchange is happening all over the world now. Stephen, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Gomes. I'm the co-founder of the nonprofit based here in Oregon called Kinship Earth. And we're really pleased to be here and listen to Joe Brewer's talk today. I have a question about what you call territorial governance. I just wanted to know if you could say more about that, because that seems to be that the governance is based on the land, somehow on the land. And I'd like you to just expand on what you were saying about that.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for a week about that. So I just want to say, to begin, something that Penny and I learned from talking to a really, really wise Indigenous man who teaches at the University of Trent in Ontario, named Dan Longboat, was we were talking about how colonizer culture breaks relationships. And he said you can see in a simple way there are 3 patterns of relationships that get broken. And this is how we start to think about territorial governance. And you can see this in residential schools, which is the primary weapon of genocide, to tear children from their families and to destroy their cultural lineages. And they did it at 3 levels. They break our relationship to ourselves internally. They break our relationships to our communities, and they break our relationships to land. So territorial governance is the restoring of those 3 things. Sovereignty begins when you stop just living out patterns of trauma and start living out from a place of integrity in your heart. A lot easier said than done. There is no territorial governance without the sovereignty of free people. That's the individual part. It turns out, those of you who study human development, to get to that usually means really good prenatal care, really good postnatal care, really strong social systems, an entire community, the village that raises the child. Turns out creating sovereign individuals is a profoundly social process. But for those of us from the broken world that we're in today, a lot of it's just really basic, getting your shit together, trauma healing, mindfulness work, finding your sense of purpose, discovering your calling, trusting yourself, knowing your body. So much of territorial governance comes from that place. It's like if you look at the 8 Shields or the work of John Young and the Coyote School and these kinds of things, like nature connection, the spiritual work that's involved, that enables the second level, which all these actually have to happen in parallel, which is community relationship. Us as people as like a capital P people. Like we're the people, we're the salmon people, we're the otter people. What does it mean to be the people of anything? Is that we have real relationships that are in integrity, that honor ourselves. So think of like the battered wife who is not in an honorable relationship with her husband. Right relationship is within ourselves and with each other at the same time. And so a lot of territorial governance is in reconstructing those relationships between people around shared purpose. And then the third level, the connection to the land, which is actually where the first one begins, you don't actually find sovereignty in yourself without connecting to land. It's one of those big secrets that's not a secret at all. Like all these self-help courses, go online, read this, do that. It's like, would you just go sit with a river? Would you watch a hummingbird? Watch a child laugh? By the way, children are land, in case you didn't notice. They're animated dirt. Living beings are part of the land. Indigenous people know this. The land is dreaming in the form of the bird. All that stuff is not just a metaphor. Biology sort of plays it out. But I think the territorial governance gets really important when we start to see that the sovereignty needs to be multi-level simultaneously, which is where things like sociocracy come in. So as you don't know, sociocracy is a way of creating small groups that work together, where each of them has their own clear set of purpose. Like our role is to be sure the catering is done for lunch. Our role is to be sure the guest list is well organized. So there are small groups with really clear focus and good coordination between them. That's just a simple way of starting to get at why sociocracy is a thing. It's a way of governing with multiple groups, with interaction between multiple groups. A lot more details. We could do a little teaching on sociocracy if we wanted. But in a nutshell, you have to create this governance that's able to do multiple things together. And so that means cooperation is really key. And what I found about cooperation is the best measure of where cooperation is about to fail is if you measure how people interpret other people's intentions when there's stress. It's like, do I believe the other person has good intentions, or do I believe them to be a bad person? Is your single best measure of whether cooperation is about to collapse. Because if Bretton and I are collaborating, there's tension, but I believe he has good intentions, I'll actually listen to him. I'll actually be open to changing my mind. I actually won't be defensive. So a lot of this is about holding the ability to trust in the good intentions of others. Now notice that the ability to believe in the good intentions of others is also to not be a sucker. If Brett's trying to cheat me, I better be able to figure that out. So there's a lot about discernment in governance. That's really another big area. Like I said, we could spend a week on this. Let's just talk about discernment for a moment. We live in a post-truth world where a lot of people don't even care what's true. They just don't even care. The truth gets in the way. So caring about what's real, which, by the way, that's a whole thing called metaphysics that's about that. It's not easy to figure out what's real. You have to do a lot of work to figure out what's real. That there's a whole realm of sense-making and discernment. For those you know the work of people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Greenhall and the Consilience Project, and there's a bunch of people who work on the sense-making part to remind us that if it just naturally happened, we wouldn't need them trying to figure it out because it's actually really hard. So there's a big part also about the efficacy of information and sense-making. And by the way, the best way to break down sense-making is to have a trauma response. So you're just responding to your own emotional, like your internal fires that are going off instead of sense-making outside. So there's like layers to that. So I'm just sort of painting a picture of topics we could explore in the afternoon, actually, because territorial governance is many and multifaceted and goes. It's actually the most important part, and it touches everything, and you can enter it from anywhere. So, how's that for a smorgasbord of topics? Ooh. Yeah, and I was just like touching it. There's more. Got it. Should I get off my soapbox? So yeah, continuing, please.
Yes, when I looked at the chart of the investments over 20 years, 10 years, how can we reconcile this with what we know through Jim Bendel and others, that collapse has already started? And it's going to be there, more visible, including to the most privileged of us, within the next 5 years. How is that compatible with these investments that you're talking about, building for the long term? And as an elder, 83, I'm particularly sensitive to that. How much can be done that will bear fruit way beyond my own life.
So a really good question was asked for those of you who may not have heard it, which is how do we reconcile the fact that we're already in an accelerating, cascading collapse when I showed a graphic of a funding model that's 20 years or longer? Take a little brief detour into evolutionary biology because it'll help us answer the question. Evolutionary biology for a long time was just like mythic stories and not very well grounded and a bunch of really poorly constructed philosophy till this guy Charles Darwin came along and showed us a way of understanding causation without having any of the language of complexity science. And so we had this theory of natural selection. This is 1859, he wrote this. And it became one of the most revolutionary ideas in all of science. It's still widely misunderstood today. Between 1859 and about 1928, almost all of biology thought that they had thoroughly discredited Charles Darwin and that the theory of natural selection didn't work. And it was because biologists are famously bad at math. If you think of the scientists who like math, they tend to go toward physics. The scientists who don't like math tend to go towards something more qualitative. And so there's a very good reason why a lot of the history of biology is not written by mathematicians. So that meant that they needed a really good statistician to come along, a guy named R.A. Fisher, Ronald Fisher, who had looked at the way biology was being done. I was like, you guys are not doing your bookkeeping right. You're like double counting these things. You're talking about biological traits that are being selected for, and there's adaptation. You're not even measuring them right. So he just set up a good accounting system, and he created a thing called population statistics. And population statistics allows us to see natural selection plays out at the population level. It's statistical. It's the distribution of offspring relative to the previous generation. It's statistical. I go this direction to answer your question because we have to play a population statistics game if humanity is not going to go extinct. And the way that evolution works is at the population level. Here, what I mean by population is you have some collection of individuals. I'm going to use individuals as human cultures to just make it a little more interesting in a moment. You have a collection of individuals, like you have a bunch of rabbits that all live in the same forest. It's a collection of individuals. They have diverse traits. They have diverse physical traits and behavioral traits. Some of them are better adapted to the environment at that moment, and statistically, they tend to have a higher frequency of reproductive success. That's the key insight for natural selection. So you have to understand that there's a population with diversity, and selection happens at a population level. The way that humans don't go extinct, intentionally, not just by accident, is to look at the population of regenerative cultures around the world, because all the non-regenerative cultures are going to select out. That's what unsustainable means. They're going to go away. We need as many of those as possible to survive, but we don't expect all of them to. It's like pruning a tree or pruning a network. We need as many places as possible trying to do this because not all of them are going to make it. And all of them at local places, they're only going to work if they're thinking long term. So here's your paradox. Okay, the global economy could just collapse tomorrow. Oh my gosh, it almost did in 2008, right? The global economy, like the stock market and all that, could just collapse at any time. It's really fragile. Global supply chains were shut down by COVID in 2020. It could happen again. If we had two major severe weather events in two different bread baskets in the same year, 2 billion humans starved to death in the same year. Because there are only 5 major bread baskets of the world, where like 80% of the world's food is grown. And statistically, that's going to happen at some point, right? Just look at all the extreme weather events. So we know these kinds of really big things are coming. The paradox, it's a paradox because it seems to be contradictory, but it's not, is that the only way to create regenerative cultures is if we start to think long term. Michael Dowd, another friend of mine, he has a really nice way of describing it. He's like, all of the sustainable cultures are pro-future. They actually have social norms reinforced through their rituals and beliefs that believe in and act in service to the future. No, I don't pee in that river because that river's a person, and as a person, I give veneration to the person and actually act in a way that is supportive of future generations, pro-future. We need all of these cultures to be pro-future, which means they're thinking for the long term. It's the only way that they work. So they have to do that, even though they have to do that through collapse, because they're not going to stop collapse. And that's the part that is the little secret message that shouldn't be so secret, is we're not trying to keep an unsustainable culture going indefinitely and then pretending that that's sustainability. Like, oh, we're going to have sustainable cities with 8 billion humans with the most unsustainable cultural model ever created, and that's going to somehow become sustainable because I snap my fingers, is just bullshit. And so the way we create sustainable cultures is by having them work for the long term. And one of the things that's interesting is that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so what I found in my work, because I studied phase transitions and complex systems, so I understand how collapse works as the reordering of a system, is that the best regenerative work is done in post-collapse contexts. I'll give you an example. In the 90s, Detroit, an industrial city, collapsed. Went from 1 million people to 100,000 people in 10 years. 90% of the population left. There was Devil's Night. They burned tens of thousands of houses to the ground on Halloween. And it was all the poor black people were left. I'm oversimplifying, but not by much, because of the racism that's there. And all the rich white people left. It's sort of like the shorthand version of what happened in Detroit in the 90s. And then you know what happened? A cultural renaissance. All these empty houses and squatters started coming in, creating artist cooperatives and all kinds of things. First African-American mayor of Detroit ever, granting squatters' rights. If you make any measurable improvements, you get the deed to the house. And they started creating a different economy. It was post-collapse. And so there's this really beautiful secret, which is the pre-collapse economies can have people with conscience and they can invest resources in post-collapse places to prototype the regenerative economies. Like they could invest in Barichara, a place that's becoming desert after cutting down its forest, where all the rivers are already dead. And they could create a regenerative economy there because there's no damn economy in the way that's going to stop it. That economy's already gone. It's already broken. And so that's why the future not being equally distributed is so important. So I would just say that if we're going to do something like restore the health of the watershed, we're talking about 50 to 100 years. If we're going to restore, if you look at the example John D. Liu did with his green gold video, it was about 18 years with the epic power of China to make it happen, which is they forced a regime change in land ownership. They had hundreds of thousands of people, and in 18 years, they turned extreme desert into an organic agriculture zone with massive reforestation and water restoration. So some things can be done more quickly than we realize, but other places, like here, restoring these forests, 500 years. And then the trees, really be mature trees, 3,000 years. Think of the redwoods. They live 3,000 years. They're the 400-foot canopy, the giant trees. And so there's going to be this phased process of regeneration that's basically never going to stop. But the key to this, maybe this will be my stopping place and then we can eat, is notice the one thing I haven't really talked about that's at the heart of it all is this is a spiritual transformation. It's a spiritual transformation. We as human beings have to become part of the consciousness of the earth as conscious human beings. And then we have to give ourselves into a future we're not going to see. That is spiritual.
That's what Kinship Earth is focused on right there.
Hell yes. That's what.
Inner development goals.
The inner development goals. And this is a huge deal. So when we're talking about regenerating Cascadia, the place it begins is with the devoted. The people who are already devoted to that future. And these are the kind of people coming to our conversations this week. Some of you all here. We met a few of them in Eugene the other day. We're going to meet a few more when we get up to Vashon, I'm sure. So one of the secrets in all this is that there's been a quiet revolution happening for a long time, and it is now congealing itself into being, just in time, because there's no time left. So with that, let's break for some lunch, and then we can come back and do a bioregional mapping session with Brandon. And is there anyone who'd like to walk us through the lunch protocols? Kirsten?